guys, what are we going to do today? Well, it is spring. So even if it is snowing, it is spring. So I thought we should start on our fun spring displays, whether it's for Mother's Day or anything for summer. We are making this cute little Tussie Mussie. Let's get started. So the first thing you're going to need is a funnel. And you could probably use a plastic funnel. I just have some old metal funnels. So this is what I'm going to use. I'm just going to seal it with a sealer. And I'm just using Minwax polyacrylic crystal clear. And we're going to set this aside and let this dry. And I am going to use my IOD molds. And this is one of my trimming molds around the top and around the bottom. I'm going to put a little bit of cornstarch in my mold, and I'm using my IOD air dry clay. But there are a lot of clays out there that you can use. And my funnel is now dry. I'll need another little piece. Add some cornstarch. So I'm going to use my Tight Bond Quick and Thick, and this glue seems to grab fairly quickly and it works well. And I'm just going to put this around the edge and even on this top edge here. Start right here. Put this on the top edge. I'm just going to slightly fold it just over this rim. I'm going to cut this edge right here. Out to there. And I'm really just going to tear it and lightly press this in. And since this is at an angle, I am going to just carefully squish this bottom edge down so it lays flush with the funnel. So when you do it, just do it real carefully along the edges so you don't take out all the definition of your image. I'm going to set this aside and let some of this dry a little bit to get a crust on it before I put a base coat on here. So I'm using a 3" by 18" piece of, this is like a satiny silk fabric, and I'm going to do a gather stitch at the one bottom edge. Now, if your funnel is bigger or smaller, you'll need to adjust your size to that. So you can see I sewed a gather stitch along the bottom, a large stitch, so I can pull this thread later, but you could do it after you paint it. I'm just doing it now. And then I'm going to use a white, and this is just vintage linen, and I'm going to paint this. I'm not going to paint over the stitch, or not much. I don't want my stitch to dry with the paint on it and then I can't pull it. I'm going to be using my paint inlays, and I am just, while this paint is very, very wet, I am just going to start laying some of these on here. And if you need to keep it wet, you can always spray your paint a little to keep it nice and damp. Now you're putting the paint side, this is actually like a paint image, you're putting that side down and pressing this in. So I'm just doing a small section at a time here so my paint does not dry before I've gotten the inlay put on top. So I'm just going to spray the back with water really quickly, making sure that it's adhered to the actual fabric and it's making contact with the paint, and then I'm going to let this dry. So this is dry, and what I'm going to do is just lightly spritz with water so I can take this backing off without ripping it. Here we go. And I save these little pieces because you can use them again, usually a couple times, but even after that, I use them and I actually decoupage the paper onto projects. What I'm going to do is let this set for a moment. I'm going to use a little bit of my vintage photo Distress ink, and I am just gonna go a little bit, just a little bit here and there, because when I seal it, it will spread this ink. And I'm also gonna add a little bit of this chippy paint stamp to this. And I'm gonna use my polyacrylic wax crystal clear, and I am just going to go over the top of this. And see, it kind of moves the distressing ink around. And it's also gonna seal these on here. Now, we are going to pull these threads. Make a knot at one end so the gather doesn't come all the way out. And this has got a little bit of a crust on it. I want to see how tightly I need to gather this. So after I've got it to about where I think I'm going to want it, I can move these gathers around. I'm just going to tie a knot with the two ends. Now I can move some of these gathers around. And I know I'm going to overlap a little bit here. So I'm just going to take this off and let this set right now that I've got it at a point where I want it gathered. And I'm going to do a base coat on this. And this is still a little damp. It's not really hard and dry yet, but that's okay. So I'm going to use my vintage linen again. And I'm just going to base coat this. And a lot of this will be covered, but you may see a little bit on the inside. I'm gonna let this dry real quick. So the paint on here is dry. The clay still has not hardened, but that's okay. I just wanna get these basic pieces put on, and then we will let all the clay pieces dry. I want this clay to show, but I also want this to go up fairly high. So I'm gonna pull this off and put Tite Bond Quick and Thick around this edge. This top edge where the gathered fabric is going to go. So some of this paper inlay that I just used, I am going to decoupage around the bottom of this base. Just going to glue it down and wrap it around, and then I'm going to push it in at the bottom. Just take a little bit of your glue or decoupage medium. And since I have this right here, I'm just going to use this. And before we're finished, we're going to seal this whole thing. So this will actually stay on very, very well. Next thing we are going to do is do our second piece of clay that's going to wrap around the bottom. And this is the same mold I used earlier. I am just going to do a different part with the leaves. I thought that was very pretty at the bottom of it. I want it to go at the edge of this gather. So I'm going to glue this down and then carefully press some of that in so it fits more angled. So where I have my opening here, that's where I'm overlapping these two edges. And then very carefully, without taking away any of the detail, I'm just carefully pressing it in a little bit, so it lays a little flusher with this edge of the funnel that gets narrower. So now I am just gonna let this clay totally set and dry before I move on. So now that all of my clay is dry, I am going to paint the molds, and I'm using a crinoline. It's just a little more vintage than the vintage linen, and I am gonna cover where all the clay parts are. You can use whatever colors you want on this. If you want to, you can also paint this whole inside and seal it. And now I'm gonna paint the bottom of this where the clay was, because it's dry also, in the same color. I'm just gonna be careful not to get it on the paper. So I'm just gonna let this dry and then we're gonna seal it. So my paint is dry, so I'm gonna seal this, and I'm just using my Minwax polyacrylic sealer. And I'm just going to go over all of these clay pieces. Okay, so let's let this dry. So this sealer is dry, and I'm using my DIY paint. And this is 1 technique that I use that this paint works amazing with. So after I put my sealer on, there is the crinoline, the off-white underneath, the sealer is on top, and then I'm gonna be using the Cowgirl Coral. Now when I cover this with Cowgirl Coral and then wipe it back, the Cowgirl Coral is just gonna go into the crevices where I've not wiped it back. So when you're painting with a couple different colors and doing this, the first color you use is really gonna be your background color. And the second color you use is gonna be your accent. And I'm gonna do the same thing on this top rim of clay. So I'm just gonna let this dry a little bit, and then we're gonna wipe this back. So this paint is dry, so I'm gonna take a baby wipe and start down here, and I am going to start wiping back. And you can do as much or as little as you would like. Now I wanna be careful that I'm not rubbing this paint on to this fabric. So I'm just gonna really try to keep my baby wipe on the clay. So let's do the top the same way. Now when you're doing this, you need to move your baby wipe around, because when there's a lot of paint on it, you're just literally moving that paint to another section. I'm gonna put a little bit of my vintage photo on here, just a little bit, not a whole lot. And then when I put my last coat of a sealer on here, it'll help move it around. So I'm just going to put one last coat of sealer on this. Let's get the bottom. We'll let this dry. Well, I hope you guys thought this was fun, at least a little different of an idea. So if you had lots of really big flowers, you may even want to cut a funnel so the hole is bigger. And all you're going to do is put your flowers into it. I added a little bit of cotton in there to hold them into place. And we tied some sari silk to the bottom, but you could even add charms and other things. But I hope you guys give this a try, but whatever you do, have fun.